Transmedia storytelling is an approach to storytelling that actually expands your story over timelines, territories and audiences. The official term for transmedia storytelling was coined by Henry Jenkins in his book Convergence Culture in 2006, and really applies to the telling of a story over a series of platforms, with each platform adding a unique quality to the telling of the story. So it's not repurposed content, it's a story that travels. For me, the trans in transmedia is indicative of the fact that the story travels and moves across platforms. So why would you adopt a transmedia approach to your storytelling? The key to that actually is the word approach. It's not a quick fix. It's not something that you can just overlay as a template to your story. It is an approach to storytelling with a very keen eye to the audience. I feel that the reason that you would adopt a transmedia approach is to actually, there's a lot of reasons. You would prototype your story. You can test elements of your story on an audience. You can have a clearer vision and idea of actually who your audience are. In some of the case studies that I've been putting together, one of the most massive fails is where the producers or the storytellers aren't really aware of who they're telling the story for. There are ways of layering an experience or layering a way that you tell a story that you can reach out to a different demographic of audience in each way. There was a project that I ran for my master's degree in 2006, and by adopting a transmedia approach, I actually pulled a lot of 20-something men into a love story by telling it from a different perspective on a platform where they were hanging out. And when they eventually found that they were involved in this big love story, they were devastated to realise they'd given their time to something and that they'd liked something that they perhaps wouldn't have gone into a bookstore and picked up a book about. So to have a transmedia approach is a smart way of thinking. You can extend your story over a far longer timeline. So perhaps you would read a book in a couple of days, or you might watch a film or a movie and it could take you 3 hours. Even, maybe kind of an episode of something on the television. If you watch the whole series, you might get 20 hours of viewing perhaps. But to tell a story in a transmedia way, you've actually got a runway where you're attracting a community and an audience. And experience builds community. If you can deliver an experience to an audience prior to a TV show running live or a publication of a book, you've already got an engaged fan base there that are ready to run with your story and play with it in different ways. So I've already said that it's not a template that you can overlay. It actually is an approach to telling story, and the word story is key for me. I've seen again some case studies where there's no eye to really what the story is or why they're telling it or who they're telling it to. The availability of platforms and social media that are free has attracted a rush and a surgence to telling stories quickly on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, but with no underlying DNA or heartbeat or theme to your story. It's just more noise. It's out there with the cat videos on YouTube. So the way I teach transmedia storytelling begins very much with story. And I know to people that have perhaps worked in broadcast for a long time, or even in publishing, or even in theatre, they know story. They've read all the Robert McKee and the Sid Field books and the Joseph Campbells. But now is a time to revisit that. For me, that central core theme, or the genre, not even the genre, the core theme, the DNA, the heartbeat of the story, is the place to begin. Because by identifying the theme of your story, you identify the conflict and the core question. Then that takes quite a long time actually to do that. For my personal story, it took me a year to figure that I was writing a story about temptation versus conscience. That's not an easy thing. I've rolled that out in a sentence as if it's something you can do overnight. That's tough. And it takes a core team with a core vision to actually figure out what that key question is and that key theme around your story. However, once you have that, things do start to get a little bit easier. From having that core theme or that central heartbeat of your story, you can begin to build your story world. So you could tell the same story, take something way back, Gilgamesh or something like that, some mythological story that we've known for years. And you could tell that as a historical tale, you could tell that as an animated cartoon for kids, you could tell that as a science fiction in the future, By taking that core theme of the story, you can tell it in many different ways, even across many different genres. But by knowing where your story world sits, gives you an idea then of the genre of your story and who you're telling it to. So by building the story world around that core theme, you have something then that you can start beginning to build out. So you would perhaps work on a log line for your story. So it's a reminder to everybody what exactly is the story you're telling. So is it, light versus dark, or is it, love versus hate, perhaps? Then you start working on who your central characters might be. Who your characters are and the genre of the world that they're living in helps to define who your audience will be. So if you're telling perhaps a romantic comedy, you've already got an idea who your audience will be before you even take it any further. Say, for example, Harry Potter. Harry Potter's story could easily have been told perhaps within the confines of Hogwarts. We didn't really need maybe to see anything beyond that. But the way the story world was designed, we saw the Black Lake and we saw the Quidditch pitch and we went to Hagrid's house and the Weasley's house and various other places that actually built out the premise of the story world. And if you don't have that core theme and that world, as it begins to travel across platforms over timelines, you have a danger that the story core is diluted. So people that enter the story perhaps later down the line don't really understand why they're in there or what they're supposed to do. So you have your core story, you have your story world that you build. The next thing I like to look at is audience. This is often the thing that's ignored. There are new ways that audiences are talking to storytellers, whether it's through broadcast or social media, whatever it might be. But there's a way that we need as storytellers to listen to our audience and be aware of who they are. It's no longer just a push broadcast with our fingers in our ears. We need now to know who they are, how they react and what they want. So you have your story world, you define your audience. Are they players? Are they gamers? Would they look for clues? Are they passive? Are they active? How would they react? The theme parks in Disney managed to create an experience for all types of players, from the 3 or 4 year old toddlers right up to their 70, 80-year-old grandparents, by layering the experiences that they can deliver dependent on the age group and also dependent on how active or passive that audience might be. So there's a skill actually in weaving those levels of immersion and those calls to action for different types of audiences or players. So then you have your story world, you have your audience, and you've started to look at the experience you want to deliver. There are case studies I've looked at that have failed because they have tried to deliver a far more active experience for a story world that's actually quite passive. The story's delivered in quite a slow-paced, passive way, and yet they were disappointed that their audience didn't jump up and start running around the streets and looking for clues. So it's kind of like spinning lots of plates at the same time, but with a good strategy and a good team, I think it's quite manageable to do. Once you have that nailed, the next thing you look at is the platforms. So I've found a tendency where this is the next step. Some people look at the platforms and the story and the audience and the experience are ignored. They're the ones that fail. They're the ones that give the transmedia storytelling ethos bad press. Once you've got to the point of looking at your platforms, if you've considered all of those points, i.e. your theme, your audience, the experience you want to deliver, the platforms start speaking up for themselves. And there have been occasions where Facebook and Twitter don't feature as main drivers of the story, dependent on what the genre is and who the audience are. I've worked with authors that are writing for retired people, retired ladies actually specifically, and were trying to seed their story on Facebook, and it just wasn't the right place. So you're doing yourself a favour by taking the time, and it does take time, to consider your story, your audience and your experience. Because then by the time you get to choosing your platforms, you're more inclined to make the right choices faster. You also can then prototype areas of your storytelling. You can adopt a top-down, bottom-up approach. You can go onto these social networks and be very transparent and say who you are and that you're creating a documentary or a story about whatever it might be, and ask for people who might like to collaborate or might like to feature as characters or even to share ideas. So that would be the top-down approach, where you're coming to them and telling them what you want and what you're doing. The bottom-up approach might be to join these communities as an equal member of the community and to listen to the conversations, maybe to ask them questions and find out exactly what the people like, what they're talking about, where they're hanging out, how they behave. There are other ways to find out more about your audience, but you can use platforms not just as a broadcast tool or a sharing tool, but also as a way to engage and link in with communities, which is why a lot of indies are doing so well at telling these types of stories very quickly. There was a blog post I read the other day about something Indiecopolis or something, where the indies are really rising up and they know how to tell the stories and they know who they're telling them to. So the final step then for me is to look at your rollout and your model. There's a lot of discussions about business models around transmedia storytelling, revenue opportunities, third-party stakeholders and partnerships. There's also a lot of musical references used when people talk about transmedia storytelling. They talk about the harmonies between platforms. They talk about orchestrating the rollout of story across different platforms. They talk about the symphonies between the way the stories are told in different places. And really, I feel to look at transmedia storytelling through the lens of musicality actually helps for me to visualise how it all should work as one beautiful, harmonious symphony. But obviously, that's a big task to take on. In terms of timelines of rollout, you need to consider, or you will have already considered, the timeline of your story. You could be telling a story like 500 Days of Summer that you will tell over 500 days. You might tell that story over an hour. I think it was probably 90 minutes of the movie. A very non-linear story that depicted the highs and lows of a relationship. That would have been perfect, I think, to have had a transmedia strategy applied to it, where different components of that could have been told in different ways and across different timelines. But you also look at the timeline of your rollout. A lot of people refer to a runway, where there's content perhaps that rolls out online or as a live event or some kind of gameplay that you hope to acquire a dedicated, loyal fan base or audience. You need to make sure that your runway is long enough, that people care enough, that when that jumps from what it might be, live events, social media, onto TV or onto something else, that they are happy to continue the journey with you. That runway time is critical, that you are actually accruing the audience that you want, and to listen back to them and hear what they need to. And then you might have the time where your project runs live, in whatever form that might be. By which time that ends, you hopefully have an engaged, loyal audience. You hopefully have been able to define them into different roles. You're always going to have the advocates who love your story so much they'll continue to tell it. You'll also have what we call the gardeners, which are people that like to keep it tidy and kind of police it for you without wanting any accolades or shout-outs or public recognition. And then you're always going to have the disruptors, the people that want to come in and mess that up all over the place. And you hope that your advocates will be the ones that get them out of the way. But then you perhaps need to consider your rollout model for how to handle the disruptors. So in terms of layering your story and rolling it out, it might be an idea to look at ways where you have rolled out a place for the disruptors to disrupt and to play without it impacting too badly on your story. So then you could look at perhaps the idea of paywalls, what people pay for. People pay for immediacy. People pay for convenience and accessibility. So somebody might have a DVD at home, but they would pay to access it instantly on the device. People pay for personalisation. So if there's a way that you can make them a valid part of your story, there's a whole list of things that people will pay for. But for me, that whole flow of beginning with your heartbeat of your story, considering your story world, your audience, the experience you want to deliver, then looking at your platforms, then looking at your rollout model, and also building in a way to continue the conversation. I've worked on projects where there's been 80, 90,000 followers and fans of a story, and when the story ends, it shuts down. You've got 80,000 people talking about your story in forums or on Facebook or on Twitter, and you just walk away and leave them. You wouldn't walk out of a party of that amount of people knowing you had them in the palm of your hand and just close the door. So in part of your planning, I think it's of huge value to take that audience that you've managed to build and move them onto something else. Whether that's something that the audience want to make or build themselves, so you give them the story world, or something that you decide that you'd build out further. But I think there's huge value in the notion of transmedia storytelling, that kind of approach to telling stories. I think as storytellers on whatever platform or medium, we're more connected and engaged with our audience potentially than we ever have been. And up until now, the only way as a storyteller we could see the reaction of the audience to our story is to write it as a stage play and to stand behind the scenes and look out at the audience at their expressions on their face. Those days are gone. It's scary times because sometimes we don't want to hear what they've got to say, but to show the three things that I always say about transmedia storytelling is to be genuine, to be relevant, and to be credible. And that means to be genuine to your story, be genuine to your audience, and be genuine to the platforms that you use. And equally, to be relevant to those three things as well, and to be credible to those three things too. So that's my summary on transmedia storytelling. You can find me through EUROVISION Academy or through storycentral.com. I'm Alison Norrington. Thank you very much.